Do opposites really attract? Hey my loves, welcome to my channel. My name is Natasha and this is All of Tash. On my YouTube channel we do a little bit of lifestyle, a little bit of beauty, work-life balance, self-help, but today I actually wanted to go back to my roots. When I first started this YouTube channel, I actually used to review TV shows like The Real Housewives of Durban, Nagwe 2, just your typical reality TV shows, but I haven't been inspired to share my commentary until recently. By now you would have heard of or at least seen the Netflix TV show The Polygamist, which was inspired by the 2012 Netflix, not Netflix show, it was inspired by the 2012 book titled The Polygamist by Sunyati, and it was produced by Stained Glass Productions. Now this series covers a huge variety of topics, right? From patriarchy to colorism, fatphobia, power dynamics, classism, resentment, envy, expectations and responsibilities, and so much more. However, in this video I want to focus specifically on the question if, like, opposites attract, because we often hear that when it comes to dating, and I want to explore that question within the realms of the patriarchy. The polygamist might as well be called the patriarchy. So I will be focusing specifically on this clip over here, not necessarily on the show. Of course, I'll use references from the show, but we will be focusing on the show because I believe, on this clip, sorry, because I believe that this clip foreshadows a lot of what we see in The Polygamist. Now, if you haven't watched the series or the show, please go ahead and pause this video, watch the series, and then come back because there will be a lot of spoilers. But if you've definitely watched it, let's get into it because there is a lot to unpack. Do opposites attract? Now, from a scientific or a physics point of view, yes. This is used to commonly explain how, magnetic forces come together. So you have positive electrical charges that attract negative electrical charges, right? The North Pole and the South Pole, for example. However, people also tend to use that same term, opposites attract, when it comes to social relationships, more specifically when it comes to dating and pairing long term. It's kind of used to describe personalities or archetypes that won't necessarily from surface view look like they work together, but people kind of use it to describe why they work together. For example, you have the guy from the hood, with the suburban girl, or the savior and the project, the princess and the bad boy, the emotionally needy and the avoidant, the beauty and the beast. The list goes on. On the surface level, these archetypes kind of bring characteristics that kind of complement each other, sort of like a puzzle piece. Your strength might be my weakness, and so your strength comes in handy when we need to do whatever, but my strength might be your weakness, and so the same applies. The intro of The Polygamist displays a bird and a fish, two completely different creatures that exist in different habitats, have different survival tactics, different environments, and almost everything about them is polar opposite. So to explore the question if opposites attract, I will be looking specifically at this artwork piece, like I said earlier, but I will be looking at the color used in the artwork, the creatures used in the artwork, and the habitat used in the artwork. Throughout society, we use color to classify things or to put meaning to things. So for instance, when it comes to classifying gender, we mostly associate pink with girls and blue with boys. When it comes to emotions and how we use color to symbolize emotion, red is often seen as a color that is associated with passion, seduction, and sometimes even anger. Blue, on the other hand, is used to symbolize calmness. In this artwork, we see four main colors: blue, gold, white, and charcoal, which I think the artists use on purpose to help us but to allow us to challenge the notion, what is opposite in this case? Because both creatures are the same color, they're both gold. So what is opposite if we're both gold? What is opposite if both our environments are blue? I think The Polygamist represents how the main character Jozi and his wives seem to exist in this overlapping web of similarities and differences. They're all of African descent, which means everyone is likely to have experienced what it is like being a black person in society. One is a bird, one is a fish. They're both gold. On the other hand, I find the blue in the artwork very interesting because at first glance, you don't know if you're looking at the sky or if you're looking at the ocean or whatever water body that is. It's only when the two creatures meet that we realize that we're actually looking at two completely different things at the same time, being the sky and water. When it comes to the polygamist, the contrast of these habitats can be interpreted as a metaphor for class hierarchy. And I think your initial perspective kind of says a lot as to who you align or what you align with. We know that both habitats are blue, however, that seems to be the only similarity between the two. Which leads me into the next chapter of this video, which is the habitat of both of these creatures. If we look beyond color on the surface level, we know that each environment is completely different, right? Forcing each creature, being the bird or the fish, to rely on very different survival tactics to survive in its environment. One environment is dry when the other is wet. The other is, geographically higher than the other. And when it comes to the polygamous, I believe that these habitats for the creatures can be used as a metaphor to identify or to classify the class hierarchy between all the characters that we see within the show, but more specifically focusing on Jozi and Joyce. So going back to this artwork, when we look at the bird dominates the sky. It comes from a world where it can see danger from miles away, and it also has the ability to flee danger immediately and go wherever it pleases. If we look at the characters, Joyce and her mom, who are individuals that come from environments of financial security, education, and social influence, as well as access to opportunities. Whereas others, such as Jonas and Essie, come from circumstances where resources are scarce and opportunities are limited. These differences ultimately shape how people view relationships, marriage, friends, and family. This creates an interesting lens for discussing how wealth, class, beauty, and education, religion, or gender can grant power in one social environment while offering very little advantage in the other. Now that we have explored the color and the habitats that we see in this artwork, let's actually dive deeper into the actual creatures. Now, I find this very interesting because the artists specifically used a bird and a fish. They could have used two birds or two fish, but instead they chose a bird and a fish. And what I drew from that is that no matter who you are in society, before you become a teacher, before you become a colleague or a husband or a wife, you are most likely to be shaped by the circumstances that you come from. Now, this is not to say that as an adult, you can't outgrow those circumstances, you can't change, you can't be better if you came from not so great circumstances. All of these things go back to your early childhood development and your environment as a developing human being in society. It's also your community and your environment that shapes how safe you feel as a child and how safe you feel as an adult, right? Because for many people, it's your childhood that kind of shapes how you view love. It is your family that shapes how you resolve conflict. It is your community that teaches you how to engage with one another and what is expected from men and women. So when two people meet, they aren't just bringing two different personalities into the relationship. They're bringing together two worlds. In the polygamous, Jonas doesn't simply marry different women. He marries different ways of seeing the world. Joyce represents one way of thinking about marriage. Another thing I couldn't help but notice in the intro is that we never see the bird dive into the water, or we never see the fish come out of the water. They both meet at the surface. And I think that says a lot, that no matter which environment you come from, in a way you are kind of confined to that environment. And not only are you confined to that environment mentally or psychologically, but for some people they really are confined to that environment financially, because some people never leave their communities that they grew up in. I feel like this video was going so professional until I had a cup of tea, and there are quite a few layers when it comes to the intro and how we look at this art piece, right? Because if you look at, and I'm going to specifically talk about Grace-Mthembu and Essie, right? on social media, they are kind of classified as having bird brain mentality, or them being, birds, right? But I think it's very different how all of these characters are slightly they're different, right? They come from different upbringings, but they all ultimately share some things in common, right? And that is the expectation that society places on women, that no matter what crumbs you are given, you must just be happy that you're getting crumbs. And I think that is a common thread amongst all women. But how they kind of navigate that expectation is actually very different, right? You have Essie. I was talking to someone, and they pointed out that Essie is actually a victim of fat phobia and colorism, which is something I didn't notice in the beginning. But it is true, right? Essie is a big girl, and she's dark skinned, right? And society kind of considers women of those features to just be happy with what they get. Oh, your man is cheating on you, but be happy. You're a big girl and you're dark skinned. No one really wants you like that, right? That's what society says to these women, whether it's directly or indirectly. But there's a lot of conditioning that comes to, or there's a lot of like, I don't think conditioning is the right word, but there is that expectation that you should be happy for what you get. And so when Essie is constantly faced with betrayal, she is often seen as someone who keeps quiet, as someone who doesn't do anything about it because society or her community she comes from a society that tells her you shouldn't, right? Whereas with Joyce, it was very traumatic for Joyce because Joyce is a suburban girl, right? She grew up in an environment where she's very safe. There aren't taverns, on the corner. There aren't guys chilling at the street corner drinking Black Label, from 10 a.m. or 9 a.m. in some cases. And so because of her upbringing, she has always been surrounded by safety. And so when she is navigating betrayal in her relationship, in her marriage, it is very traumatic for her because this is the first time that she's seeing, or experiencing something as traumatic as what Jonas is basically giving her. And then you have Matipa on the other hand, who, also doesn't come from a wealthy background, but she's very similarly to Essie, she had opportunities to better herself. Essie had the opportunity to build her own salon and build something for herself. That house that Jonas bought for her and the car, she could have easily done that for herself. Without the help of Jonas, right? She could have walked away from that situation. But because she comes from a society where women don't typically walk away, she stayed, right? Whereas Matipa, on the other hand, Matipa was kind of motivated by like some kind of desperation, which I till this day don't necessarily understand, because she's smart and she's beautiful and she could have built something for herself, but she kind of puts herself in a position where she has access to certain opportunities. I assume that she's educated, right? And that she can conduct herself, because although she sleeps her way into certain positions, in order to keep those positions, you need to actually do the job, I would assume.
Hey my loves, so I just want to wrap up what I was saying about Matipa. I lost footage, sorry about that. But what I was saying is that Matipa, Joyce, and Essie all share similarities when it comes to what is expected of them. Sorry, they all share similarities in terms of what is expected of them and their responsibilities as women, not only to uphold the space for Jonas and his lies, but to also protect his lies. However, the difference between Matipa and Essie, although they both come from backgrounds where there aren't enough resources, the difference between Matipa and Essie is rooted in fat phobia. And we see Essie kind of being expected to just sit and keep quiet and, just be happy with the little that she is given. Although her emotional needs and her family's emotional needs are not met, as long as her financial needs are met, then it's kind of expected of her not to complain about that. However, on the other hand, we have Umatipa, who kind of worked her way into the space through her beauty, right? It was her body that got her there. And the second that Jonas turned on her and started beating her was when that image and that asset, that pretty privilege, that asset was threatened. We see Mthembu turn around and actually disappear. We don't know where she ends up. We don't know where she runs to, but we see her run away, and she basically disappears from the whole story. And I think that's the difference between Essie and Mthembu, that Mthembu's pretty privilege in a way kind of does allow her to flee from these spaces because, you know, once she heals and her body recovers, she can still use her pretty privilege to get into certain spaces no matter where she is in the world.
Now, with all of that in mind, this just leads me back to the original question. Do opposites attract? I think after watching The Polygamist, it's very clear that opposites can attract or work out in certain spaces because of certain qualities or advantages that they may provide to one another. But I think long term, or at least in this example with this case study, the question isn't whether opposites attract, but the question is whether two people can understand the world that made the other person who they are. Because love may bring two people together, but understanding is what allows them to be together. This is just my interpretation of the artwork, and I'd really like to hear your interpretation or your thoughts on the art specifically. I had a conversation with someone else, and they, you know, when I was talking about the artwork, they actually thought that the roles were reversed, right? That Jonasy, or how they saw it, was that Jonas was the bird and that Joyce was the fish, right? And their perspective was that birds from an aerial view hunt down fish, right? Which I thought was very interesting because that is kind of how Jonas got he got Joyce, right? So I find it interesting how in you know, from that perspective, I guess you could say that sex was used as a tool for Jonas to kind of elevate his way up into a certain financial bracket, which is the same thing that Mthembu did. But with that perspective, I find it to be a bit limiting and not necessarily kind of aligned with, you know, all of the many examples we see in The Polygamist. Whereas with Joyce being the bird, another thing that I noticed is that because birds, you know, fly in the sky and they also live on ground or in trees or on higher ground or whatever is higher than sea level, is that they can flee. Like I mentioned, that they can see danger from a mile away and can flee the danger immediately, and they can go wherever they want to go in the world, right? And I think that is commentary on, you know, the financial background that Joyce comes from, but not only the financial background, but the nervous system that that environment has allowed Joyce to have throughout her whole life. Because when she was betrayed by Jonas, it was very traumatic. When she was betrayed by Essie, it was also very traumatic. And I see a lot of people talk about how, why was Joyce, you know, more lenient to accepting Mthembu than she was Essie. And I think it's because it was very traumatic that this person that you've known for years as a sister-in-law is actually messing with your man too. Like, I would be so, oh my goodness, I don't know what I'll do, honey. I don't know what I would do. But, you know, as, you know, going back to like the whole bird analogy, Joyce's nervous system has never had to encounter any of this nonsense. Whereas if you look at it from the perspective of Essie's whole upbringing from being a really young single mother, being a young person living in the hood, she has constantly been faced with so many traumatic instances that she's kind of like numb to the things that Jonas does, right? And not only is she numb to it, but it doesn't seem to bother her that much because from in the environment that she comes from, she is expected to just be quiet. You know, if someone is beaten up, you keep quiet, you don't really complain because it's the norm, right? Whereas for Joyce, it's not the norm, and I think that really did rock her world. Whereas the relationship between Joyce and Mthembu, you know, kind of worked its way to a much more stable environment because Joyce always knew who the enemy was from the beginning. Not that she knew who the enemy was, because the enemy was Jonas, but she saw Matipa for who she was. Matipa didn't pretend to be something that she's not, you know. So yeah. So yeah, guys, that is my interpretation of the artwork. I really enjoy looking at art. I love deconstructing art, you know, looking at the meaning behind it, the symbolism and what it represents. And I just found it very interesting that this artwork, in a way, for me, kind of foreshadowed what the show was all about. Obviously, it's only at the end of the show where you really start connecting all of the dots. But yeah, if you guys want me to do a video on how fashion was used in The Polygamist, please comment it down below, because I think fashion was used as a very strong tool in The Polygamist that a lot of people don't necessarily notice, because it is kind of embedded in our day-to-day lives, but not necessarily you don't necessarily notice the symbolism in the fashion. So yeah, I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.